All right, everybody, what is up? And welcome to another YouTube video here on the official MTG Arena YouTube channel. If you haven't already, hit that bell, toss them a subscription here to get notifications of other YouTube videos by other content creators like myself. All right, so standard metagaming is the name of the game today, and that's what we're gonna be talking about and going in a little deeper on something that maybe we've all seen and interacted with, which is a standard metagame, but maybe we all haven't been looking at the finer, small details having to do with each standard format and metagame. So we're gonna start this off by looking at the standard metagame before Phyrexia All Will Be One came into the picture. We're gonna start all the way back to the World Championship where Nathan Steuer took it down in dramatic fashion. Woo! Ah, that was beautiful to watch. Really beautiful to watch firsthand. But Nathan in this tournament really broke it. He was the only person to be playing Grixis Midrange in Standard, and it ended up being the deck of the tournament. It absolutely demolished everyone. It didn't hurt that it was in the hands of Nathan Steuer, who is, in my opinion, one of the best Magic players, if not the best right now. Came to this tournament with Grixis Midrange. So taking advantage of Fable the Mirror Breaker, Corpse Appraiser, a bunch of removal spells, and it really ended up taking out a lot of the Esper decks that were the bulk of the metagame at that time. So Nathan really figured it out there for the biggest tournament of the year, and it paid off, needless to say. So after Nathan demolished the World Championship with Grixis Midrange, the standard metagame really shifted to, yep, you got it, Grixis Midrange. That was the deck that dominated. It's a deck that's really fun and was really interesting to play at the time in a field full of Esper midrange. Grixis ended up being the deck that basically everyone was playing. You know, we were seeing top eights of different events where there was maybe 6 copies of Grixis, a couple other decks here and there, but it was the majority of the deck. When Standard is as deep as it is right now, or even when Nathan won World, where it's 6 set Standard, we're now going into 7 set Standards. And the way it works, you go to 8 set standards, and then when you hit that 9th, it goes down to 5 set standards. So these type of standards are really, really different depending on how many sets are involved. The lower the sets, the less powerful the decks. The more sets, the more it happens when new sets come into play. They're just functionally upgrading decks, and you'll maybe have a new deck in it, you know, once or twice, but for the majority, there's some really good decks, so it's really tough to create new decks in Standard, but I do have a new deck coming for you a little bit later at the end of the video that I'm very excited to share with you. So after Grixis became very popular, the next metagame shift was, how do we beat Grixis? Because, well, it's either Grixis is that good that it is gonna be the best deck no matter what, forever, and it's unbeatable and people have to pick it up, or, you know, just not expect to win as much, or people will build decks to beat it. And that's exactly what happened. After Grixis became really dominant, there were certain aggressive decks that popped up to really take advantage of the fact that 1-for-1 removal was not very good against them. Number one, what I'm thinking is Blue-White Soldiers. Blue-White Soldiers came up and just started demolishing Grixis. Too many fast creatures that are going way too wide, a bunch of tokens, which ends up being very good against Invoke Despair. Another couple decks that popped up, Mono Red Aggro. Something that was kind of being put in check by all these Esper decks, but after Grixis took Esper pretty much out of contention, Red was back to play, and Red had a pretty good matchup against Grixis. So that was kind of our first couple metagame shifts, our standard metagame shifts. After that, well, you know what? Grixis started to come back, but it looked a little bit different. A lot more removal, a lot more mass removal spells like Brotherhood's End and different sweepers like that. That brought us to, well, the point we're at right now where Phyrexia All Will Be One is coming into play. And I'm gonna help you talk about where the metagame is gonna go now, talk about some functional upgrades to some already existing powerful decks, and some new cards that's really gonna make an impact on Standard from here on out. So let's check out the first deck. All right, so of course we have to start with Grixis Midrange, and I know what you're saying. You're like, wow, there is not that many different cards here, and there's not. because this is really what I'm talking about when it gets to 7-set standard. You see these decks that are already in place. They already have such power and such kind of control over the format that it's really tough for a breakout new deck to just completely eclipse what was one of the best decks, or at least a deck that is in that tier 1 category that we were talking about before. So, all right, let's talk about the new cards with Phyrexia All Will Be One. And they're not flashy as far as this deck goes, but it's Sheoldred's Edict, Vraska, Betrayer's Sting, and probably the most important one, Blackcleave Cliffs. The Blackcleave Cliffs and the other fast lands, as I like to call them, the lands that will be untapped as long as it's turn 1, 2, or 3. We've seen those in Magic's history before, and they've always been extremely powerful lands. I was able to just cut some swamps because, well, you didn't need 5 or 6 of them, but you also wanted lands that didn't deal you damage in this deck. Bingo, Blackcleave Cliffs now does that, but also adds red mana. So Sheoldred's Edict is a card I want to focus on first because I think this is the best card for Grixis. It's just incredible. Making your opponent sacrifice a creature, a non-token creature, and then of course you can have them sacrifice a planeswalker, and it doesn't make you sacrifice anything. So this is not going to be a good card against a, let's say, token strategy from your opponent, but any kind of mid-range battle or any battle where your opponent is trying to cast a big planeswalker, you have a really versatile removal spell. Vraska is a card that I added as a one-up because I don't think it's going to be extremely good in this shell, but I think having one of these to be able to really start taking over the game, cast it for 5, cast it for 6, doesn't really matter. You either get to turn a creature into a treasure, you can turn a Sheoldred into a treasure, which is a very important card to deal with, or just start drawing cards, do a little bit of proliferating. Proliferating, not insane in this deck, but it does have some applications. You can add an extra counter to Reckoner Bankbuster, or add a counter to Fable the Mirror Breaker if you want to make it flip sooner. Let's talk about our next deck here that's a little more flashy. All right, the second deck that I really want to talk about that got some huge upgrades is Mono White Midrange. Mono White Midrange really made a huge footstep on the standard metagame the last weekend right before this set comes out, Phyrexia All Will Be One, and had some incredible results. Saw a standard challenge where there was like 4 or 5 of these decks in the top 8 and really showing how good these mono white mid-range cards can be up against Grixis, up against these other aggro decks like Azorius Soldiers and Mono Red that came to beat up on Grixis mid-range decks. Well, Mono White Midrange came to beat up on those decks, and that was another metagame shift that we noticed over times. I'm not gonna lie, y'all, I love keeping track of standard metagame shifts. It's one of my favorite things to do. Standard has always been my favorite format. So being able to look really closely at a format and notice, like, week by week, be like, wow, is this deck being pushed out because of XYZ? You know, what is going on here? And being able to break it down and see the patterns that we've seen over standard, you know, for the course of the last 10, 20 years, it's really fun to evaluate. And Mono White was the answer to all these aggro decks. That was the answer to Grixis. Now let's talk about this deck at Mono White Midrange, or as I like to call it, MOM Midrange, because it is our new card, Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. This card does some absolutely busted stuff. I'm a huge fan of this deck, and I mean, as you can see, this card is really taking some of our cards to the next level. Let's show all the cards it really works with. Ambitious Farmland, you get 2 lands. Ossification, you get to take 2 creatures. We didn't quite get the 2 creatures, but we still got to target something twice. But when it comes up, 2 mana, exile 2 creatures. If you have Elesh Norn on the battlefield, is incredible. Lauren destroys 2 artifacts or enchantments. Just all kinds of things. We saw Sanctuary Warden being able to activate twice. You can remove both those counters right away. Really does some awesome things. And then when you have this other really cool card, Mondrak, Glory of Dominus, not only are you, let's say, removing 2 counters, you're creating 2 tokens each time. You're creating 2 tokens with the Wandering Emperor. You're creating 2 tokens with the Wedding Announcement. You're creating a lot of tokens with White Sun Twilight. Another great addition to this deck that works quite well with the rest of our cards. So if you're looking to go way over the top of a lot of decks with Elishnorn, Mother of Machines, and just have a ton of triggers, well, your opponent doesn't get to have any fun with triggers, then this is the deck for you. Go ahead and try this MOM Midrange deck out for yourself. Let's take a look at the next deck that I expect to be a big player. So now let's talk about Jund Midrange. So Jund Midrange was in a really weird spot right as the World Championship happened in Pre-Phrexia All Will Be One Standard, where it was actually pretty good. You know, it was a deck that was taking advantage of some things, especially Wedding Announcement, where Unleash the Inferno was a really good card, where you were able to kill a creature and then deal with a Wedding Announcement or creature, then deal with Fable the Mirror Breaker, and that's kind of what gave Jund its power. That being said, Grixis only had Fable the Mirror Breaker and sideboarded Reckoner Bankbusters. That was a good 2-for-1 target with Unleash the Inferno. So they came out in that matchup, and if they're coming out in that matchup, you're kind of just a Rakdos deck that isn't quite as good as Grixis. I think that all changes now with Phyrexia All Will Be One. I think Jund is gonna have a huge boost once again because, well, there's a lot of really good Gruul cards. I wanna talk about some of the new additions here to this deck, and that is Miglos Maze Crusher. This card's just great. 3 mana 4/4, gets a bunch of counters, and has the ability to do a bunch of different things. Ends up just being hard to miss on this one. This card's really pushed, as in it's just a really, really powerful card. Speaking of powerful cards, this is the one I really want to talk about. It's Glissa Sunslayer. I am a huge fan of Glissa. It is so powerful. First of all, 3/3, first strike, death touch. That's already insane stats for a card like this. So anything more is just gravy. Only can you draw a card, lose a life, destroy target enchantment. Those can both come up a decent amount, especially the draw card. That's really good. But what I want to focus on is removing up to 3 counters from target permanent. That with Fable the Mirror Breaker leads to some disgusting things. If you play Glissa Sunslayer first, attack, maybe get your value to draw a card, then play Fable, now that next turn when you draw 2 cards, if you can connect again with Glissa on that turn, you can then remove both of those counters and start Fable over again. And you can keep starting Fable over if you want to keep getting the shamans. Anything that works well with Fable the Mirror Breaker in a, 2 or 3 color deck is already going to have to be considered because it doesn't take much more to make Fable the Mirror Breaker good. This is the best card in Standard before the new set. I wouldn't be too shocked if it's still the best card. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible, but if we can find more ways, like this Jund Shell, like Glissa Sunslayer, to make that card even better, why not? Let's check out the last deck, and this is a spicy one. Oh yeah, we are burning the midnight oil on this deck here. May I introduce to you Gruul Oil here. This deck is really awesome, and you know how I said that in 7-set Standard, you don't really get too many new decks because there's so many powerful decks already in place? If any deck is gonna pop up that's a new creation, it's gonna be Gruul Oil. Gruul is the guild or the color combination that I think got the most when it comes to Phyrexia All Will Be One Standard, and I think it has the highest hopes to really create a new archetype that can really compete. So we'll get into this. These are pretty much all new cards with a couple of old cards that work really well in this deck. But for the most part, these are a lot of the new ones because, well, they have to have the oil keyword, and it's a new mechanic. So not much you can do besides play the ones that are in the set. So let's start with Evolving Adaptive. This is a 1 mana 1/1 essentially. It comes into play with an oil counter, and it gets +1/+1 for each additional oil counter on it. Now we got our 2-drops, which are not that great, if I'm being honest, but there is no other great option for 2-drops, and it makes sense because if there were too many good 2-drops and the curve was perfect with these oil cards, then this deck would be the most dominant deck and it wouldn't be fun for anyone else. So we have Axiom Engraver and Predation Steward. Both of these cards are okay, but they both come into play with 2 oil counters. You can loot away with the Engraver, and then you can pay 3 mana to pump a creature with the other ability. I don't foresee ever using this ability, The loot definitely comes into play at times. Then we're gonna go to our other 3-drop creatures. If we're playing oil, of course we're gonna play the busted pushed rare that is Miglos Maze Crusher. Comes into play with 5 oil counters. 5, y'all. Okay, this is huge. That's so many oil cards. It's gonna be one of the most important cards. Now we're playing a card that did not actually make it with oil counters on it, but it does help our oil counters. That's Bloated Contaminator. Ew! What a gross picture, am I right? Oh my god, it is gross. It's doing gross things, and it makes sense that we put it in this new gross Gruul Oil deck we have. Whenever this connects, proliferate. That's the main reason it's here. So everything with an oil counter on it, you get to add another oil counter. That includes our land. That includes the Filigree Silex that we're gonna talk about a little bit later. It includes poison counters on your opponent's face. So this deck technically can deliver a poison finish, but it's very unlikely. Let's talk about another cool card that we added to this deck that isn't from the set. Kadama of the West Tree ends up working really well with oil counters because that's a modification. So whenever one of your modified creatures connects, you get to search your library for a basic land, put it into play. And you can modify them at any point with the Monumental Facade to, you know, just be able to fetch out a bunch of lands and cast all the spells you want. Now we're gonna get into some of the more fun stuff here. We have Evolved Spinoderm here. 4 mana 5/5 comes into play. 4 oil counters. Once again, noticing a theme here, of course. It has trample as long as there's 2 or fewer oil counters on it. Otherwise, hexproof. So right when you play it, unkillable. It can be countered, but this is a great card to play if your opponent has some removal that you're trying to like play around. You play this first, for a couple of turns, they can't kill it. So far, we have a bunch of oil, but we don't have anything to really do with it. So, of course, we need an oil can. So, put an oil counter on it, cool, sure. You can do that one at a time. If you can proliferate later, you can proliferate to add some counters. Second ability, sacrifice it. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on. I think this is a sleeper card. I think people are really sleeping on this card. I think it's really good. Number one, you're gonna notice a similarity to a previous card, Ratchet Bomb. It reminds me a ton of Ratchet Bomb. Being able to just play it and take out all tokens immediately when there are already token decks in the metagame and we're not playing any 0 drops, it's already just a good card, even if we didn't read the last line of text. Remove 10 oil counters from permanents you control and sacrifice this. It deals 10 damage to any target. So you can attack with a bunch of other creatures, get their life total to 10 or less, and then, well, I guess stuff like this happens. How fun is that? Oh, and as you can see, it doesn't take that much to get this many oil counters, you know? Like, when all your cards are creating oil counters, being able to remove 10 is not that hard to do, and pressuring a bunch of your opponent's cards, especially when they're tokens, this card's the real deal. Now, we also can pair it with Sulfim Mayhem Dominus. If you have this in play, and you have 10 oil counters, and you have the Filigree Silex, that's 20 damage to your opponent's face. If your deck can just deal 20, and it's also an aggressive deck, that leads to some of the best decks in Magic's history. These kind of combo aggro decks. Combo aggro, combo control end up being some of the best decks that we've seen. Last couple cards I want to talk about. Another card that makes me so excited, that's Cinder/Ravager. Look at how powerful this card can be. You remember the Chain Whirler and how good that card is? Well, this card is a 5/5 instead of a 3/3, and it has Vigilance. And with it being so cheap, based on all the different permanents, as you read closely, it costs 1 less for each permanent you control with an oil counter. Pretty easy to make this card cost a very low amount, and token decks will cry at the sight of this Gruul Oil deck. Looking at that, we also get another addition in the mana base. We're just playing the best green-red lands without playing Triomes. I don't want any lands that enter the battlefield tapped, so we get to add Copperline Gorge, another one of these fast lands, and the Monumental Facade. So really cool deck. I'm very much excited to see what kind of damage this Gruul Oil deck can do in Standard. So in this MTG Arena video, I hope I gave you some ideas of not only how metagames shift, how fast they shift, how important a new set is when it's 5-set standard versus when it's 9-set standard, and how much change we're gonna see within that set versus how much decks are going to be upgraded when it comes to what we're in. 7-set standard, going to be 8-set standard in the next set, and then the true rotation after that. Standard is my favorite format, and I love recognizing standard metagame shifts, and I hope you will like it just as much, or at least half as much as I do. If you haven't checked me out before, go check me out. I'm at Corey Ballmeister on Twitter, or CoreyB MTG on YouTube, Twitch. All right, y'all, I gotta go. I need to go play more Magic. Phyrexia, all will be one. This set is way too sweet. Okay, bye.